How complex is animal communication? Should we think of the barks, chirps, and growls that we hear really as language, and a bird and whale song socialized, or are they simply hard-coded somewhere deep within the genome? In the following conversation, I discuss animal communication and cognition with Irene Pepperberg, former Harvard academic and current president of the Alex Foundation. She's best known for her work with their African grey parrots, Alex, Arthur, Griffin, and Athena. Irene uses novel training techniques to teach her parrots how to communicate, and what she's been able to accomplish is pretty remarkable. From spelling and counting, to solving logical puzzles, to asking questions about their surroundings and even themselves, to competing with 5-year-old children on certain cognitive tests. The discussion begins with practical questions about the bird's abilities and how training is done, before diving into more philosophical questions about how animals might see the world, self-awareness and personhood, as well as animal morals and ethics. I hope you enjoy.
Escaped Sapiens.
So to start with, why is understanding the cognitive abilities of animals important? So in particular, what would it mean if researchers were able to show definitively that monkeys, birds, whales, intelligent animals were able to use language in the way that a linguist would define language? What would that mean?
It suggests something about the continuity of behavior and the evolutionary backgrounds and the idea that there is a central evolutionary basis for our communication systems. Now, so far, nothing that we have in the scientific literature shows that animals have a communication system as complicated as that of human language. But they all have communication systems that work very, very nicely for them and that are sufficient to their needs. Whether the abilities are more complicated and we are just too stupid as humans to figure out their systems, that's something that's quite possible, okay? I mean, I joke with my students that in terms of studying animal language, we are not that much different from, say, Martians that came down and play, 2 tapes outside of a movie theater. And one tape says free beer, and people are just going to go, oh, that's kind of nice, and they'll amble out for it. And the other one says fire, and we all go, screaming crazy. Now, we are a bit more sophisticated than that, but again, we really are limited in what we can do in terms of understanding what animals are communicating about and how they're doing it. And it's a really exciting topic.
So what was your original motivation then? You've been working for some decades now with parrots. What was your original motivation, and how has your motivation changed, and what's sort of your ultimate goal at this point?
Right. Well, my original goal was literally to establish a very complicated two-way communication between myself and these birds. My idea was that unlike apes, they could talk. They seemed to be very intelligent. And it would seem that, any creature on the face of the earth that you would want to do this with, it would be an animal that could literally talk back to you. There were a lot of reasons, many of which are too complicated to get into, but over the course of the years, it became more a matter of using this interspecies communication to examine their cognitive abilities. Because it's much easier to literally ask an animal to do a task or to communicate its abilities by speaking to them than it is by trying to have them press buttons or things like that. Sign language, for example, is also excellent because it's another very fluid communication system and very informative in the sense that it is open-ended. Okay, so when you're trying to communicate with an animal through a computer, there are just so many buttons that can be tapped, from both of you. Whereas once you have some kind of a repertoire, you can embellish upon it and you can use what you have in more innovative ways. And that's what made the idea of using a vocal system, so exciting for me.
But why did you fix on African grey parrots? Was there a reason? Are they particularly intelligent, or were they just available, or what was the original goal
Okay,
there?
so when you look at the literature, there had already been work on the intelligence of these birds. So if you look back to the work of Otto Köhler in the 40s and 50s, he had done a lot of work on the communication skills of these birds and on their cognitive abilities. And so it made these birds a very, good starting point because we already had some baseline data. And they also have a particularly different vocal tract system. And it turns out now we know possibly a slightly different neural system, okay, for acquiring vocalizations, which allows them to be more easily adapted to working with humans.
Huh. Is that is Do you understand why a bird with such a small brain is able to do such complicated behaviors? Do you, because if you compare birds to say a chimpanzee, the birds you work with are much smaller, right? But they're able to do pretty incredible things. Why is that?
It's not the size of the brain, absolutely. It's the relative size of the brain compared to the rest of the body, and particularly the relative size of this cortical area. Now, in primates, the cortex is the part of the brain that's so called the seat of intelligence. And if you look at the relative size of the parrot's cortical like area, it is enormous and it is incredibly densely packed with neurons. So there's actually studies out there that show that the density is about that of the non-human primates,
Hmm.
and the relative size is about that of the non-human primates, so that they've got all the possible neural, what do you want to call, computing power that they need to do this.
So that they have the same number of connections and neurons. Do they have a higher density of neurons per volume of
Yes,
brain? I see.
and connections, yes.
I see. In the wild, do they is are their vocalizations socialized or is it genetic? So the birdsong, for instance, in this species and other species.
They learn it. I mean, not all birds learn their songs. To be technical, there are the sub-Oscines that do not learn their songs. And then there are the Oscine songbirds that do learn their songs. And then there's the parrots, which are different from most Oscines because they are what are called open-ended learners. And they continue to learn throughout their entire lives. Whereas most Oscines, not all, but most Oscines learn during the first year or two of life.
Mhm.
But the parrots are completely open-ended learners.
Are the other lyrebirds and these sort of mimicking birds also on the same level as parrots in terms of intelligence?
We don't know about intelligence, but in terms of vocal abilities, yes.
Hmm. In the wild, how does the complexity of the vocalizations compare to what you can actually train them in the lab?
We are learning about that. That's all I can say. I mean, one of my students in the around 1995 was out in Africa just collecting vocalizations. She couldn't do playbacks. We didn't have the equipment and it wasn't safe, actually. They were chased by machete wielding poachers and we had to end the study. Um,
Wait, what?
but yeah, this was in 1995. You can imagine what it's like now. But the point is she filled up an entire 6, 7 foot long table with, sonograms, pictures of their vocalizations, of different vocalizations. And she could basically say, well, these are affiliative and these are aggressive and these are fear. She was able to simply given the basic, you know, where when she took them and what she was watching, what behaviors she was watching when she took she acquired these vocalizations, she could get a basic idea. But what they actually meant, that you need playbacks for. So there are huge, huge numbers of these vocalizations, and how how carefully they could be separated from one another, we don't know. There's a study on a totally different species called Forpus, a kind of an Amazonian parrot, And it turns out they seem to have individual names for each other. Okay, so there's definitely individual recognition amongst these birds. They have their own little signature whistles. So, we just don't know how complex their vocalizations are in the wild.
Do your parrots know their own names? Do they use their own names, or do they have their own vocalizations for the names?
I don't know about the latter. They certainly know their names. Okay,
Huh.
so
But but do they use? So, for example, would Alex be called Alex by Griffin? Is it, or
no,
was it?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't use the names for each other. Okay,
Hmm.
but you could, I can see out of the corner of my eye what Athena is doing, and I could say, "Stop, Athena," and she knows immediately that she needs to stop that behavior.
So I guess dogs also know their own names to a certain
Yeah,
extent. So it's not surprising that. But
yeah.
so what's special about language? So what would you have to see in what would you have to see in the behavior of a bird? What would you have to see in this list of vocalizations that you collected in order to
Oh,
say this animal has language?
that's an hour-long lecture. Okay. Um, Basically, what you and I are doing now involves language. And no matter how many years I would have worked with Alex, he would have never gotten to the point that we could have this kind of a conversation. Okay. And I mean, that's a sort of a very generic type of explanation, that it's just the complexity, the fact that we can talk about, the past, we can talk about the future, we can talk about imaginary things. All right. There's this level of complexity that, so far non-humans have not acquired.
Hmm.
That's not to say that it's impossible and that we just haven't figured out the best ways to teach them those things. But I mean, the level is just, you know, quite complicated when you're trying to explain, what you would need. Because I mean, you can look at, years ago, um, Altman and Hockett came up with, basic 13 different things that language has, and then they had a checklist whether animal behaviors, checked against this. But that doesn't get to the meat of it, which is you can check all those boxes, but the animal still can't do what you and I are doing.
With your bird specifically, do you suspect? It sounds like you suspect that just there's a mental gap there that can't be bridged, or is there also a component which is just the interface, how well the parrots, for example, can vocalize, and they're spending so much effort in developing the human words that that overrides that they have so much overhead in just making the
Yeah.
sounds that they can't communicate. Is that a component?
Well, that's a component, but we just don't know the answer to that question. We just simply don't know the answer to that question. I mean, in the wild, how much do they need to talk about the past? How much do they need to talk about the future? Um, we don't know. We don't know how important that is for them. And if they did need that, then I'm guessing that their wild communication systems would have a way of doing it and that we could map onto it. But we don't know that.
Hmm. So how does your training repertoire work? Or regime work rather. When you get a new chick and you need to start teaching this new chick how to speak, what do you do? How do you go about it?
All right, the first thing we do is we find the kinds of things that the bird is really, really interested in, okay? Like some toys that it particularly likes to play with. So in Alex's case, he really loved to chew paper. Now, an aside is that making a puff sound without lips is really, really tough. So, you know, trying to teach him to say paper was, as his first label was probably not the best thing, but he did learn to say air, okay, and we kept it with that until he learned how to use esophageal speech and actually burp out the puff. But once we find out what they want, then we use a modeling technique. And this was initially developed by Dietmar Todt, who was working in Curler's lab. Okay, that's how I learned about this. We've adapted the technique somewhat, but the basic idea is the same in that two humans demonstrate to the bird the types of behavior we want it to learn. So let's say we want, I want you to learn you're the parrot and I want you to learn the word paper. And you really want to chew on this. I mean, as soon as I show this, you are just, excited about it. So I'm sitting there with my student and I show it to her. She's the model for the bird's behavior and the bird's rival for my attention. That's how it gets the model rival or MR technique term. And I show her the thing and I say, "What's this?" And she goes, "Paper." And I go, "That's right." And I give it to her. And she goes, "Paper, paper." And she starts tearing it apart. And the bird is like, "Oh man, is watching so closely." And she then shows it to me and I say paper and I get to play with it. And the reason we exchange the roles of model, rival, and trainer is so the bird sees that one person isn't always the questioner and the other the respondent, but that it's an interactive process. But every once in a while, I'll show it to her, and instead of saying paper, she goes, "Right." And I go, "No, you're wrong," and I take it away. Now, this is important because the bird sees that not every weird new sound causes transfer of the object, but it has to be a particular sound. And then after a while, we'll show it to the bird and ask the bird to say something. And of course, it's not going to say paper right away because as understood, they have to learn how to control a series of muscles and parts of their body. So they have to learn all the muscles in the trachea, which produces, well, the first thing is the syrinx, which is their sound box, sort of like our larynx, and that's at the base of their trachea by the lungs. And then they have to learn how to control the trachea, which is about 10% difference in the vocalizations production. Like us, they have to learn how to control we do our tongue up and down and back and forth. Think about E versus ah and your mouth and everything in there. They have to learn how to control that too. So their tongues, big fat tongues, and the beak opening and closing, okay, and the glottis and the larynx that they have to learn how to control all that. And probably something about the, nasal passages maybe as well. So there's a lot they have to learn, but they'll make some kind of sound initially. So, for example, when they were learning key, Alex would go E. Okay, and you reward that initially because that's it's a sound that they can make and it's related to the sound you want. So you reward that. And then over time, you basically shape it into the k sound and you get the key.
Huh. Once you've trained one bird, can you use them as the rival for other birds or not?
Yes, but it's not easy. Okay, so it was only at the end of Alex's life that he finally agreed to stop interrupting Griffin sessions and actually work as a model
Because there's a
our session.
there's a
Yes.
dominance hierarchy, or I
Yes.
see. But would Griffin sit there and just watch the lessons that Alex had and learn sort of passively or not?
Griffin did learn some things by watching Alex, yes. So there was a time where we were training Alex on 7, okay, which was hard because of the sound itself wasn't easy, but he had s for 6. And the v he had from 5, but it's still a v. So, it's a hard time. So he's going 1 for 7 at that point, okay?
So he can count then?
Yes, he did. He could count. Yeah, that's a whole other thing we could
But so
talk
he
about.
did that by himself. He said 6 and 1 is 7 rather than just saying 7.
Yes, because that's the way he knew where he was headed, to put it bluntly, and that's the best he could do at that point. Okay, so because those were the labels in his repertoire, and then after a while he started saying 7, which actually more like a b. Okay, but he's saying 7. But while we were doing this one, I hear from the corner of the lab this other little one from Griffin, who was imitating Alex. But Alex he would interrupt Griffin when we would train Griffin. So we'd say, "Griffin, what color?" And Alex would sit there and go, "No, tell me what shape." And Griffin would look at me and look at Alex and literally shrug his little birdie shoulders and go, "Do I answer him? Do I answer you? I'm just going to be quiet and not say anything."
So do you think the interaction between the two stunted Griffin's learning process, or?
Yes, very much, very much.
I see. So they're not social in the same way that humans are, really.
Well, there was a dominance issue. Okay. I mean, Alex had been an only bird for 15 years.
Hmm.
Okay. And used to being in charge. And then this little thing comes in that's getting all of our attention. It's, it was very, very hard.
When you were teaching them numbers, did it become easier with each successive number? You know, once you taught like 2, 3, did they get very quickly the?
That's a very important question because children do. Okay. Children learn, okay, they learn one versus many. I forget, they were like about 2 years old when they start learning one versus many. It takes them 9 more months to learn one versus two versus many, and another 5 months to learn one versus two versus three versus many. But around that time, they're learning a number line. Okay.
Mhm.
So if you ask a 3-year-old to count, they'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you say, oh, my child can count. Well, they understand it about as well as they learn the alphabet when they think LMNOP is one letter. Okay. But they've got this number line. But somewhere around 4 years old, some children earlier, some children later, but somewhere between 3.5 and 4, they start figuring out that this 1, 2, 3 that they've learned that actually means something with respect to objects and this random number line are connected. And about the time they learn 4, they get it. And almost no child that is normal, okay, in terms of development, has to be taught 5. Okay, they get it. Okay, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the next one in the series, and they understand it. So is this true for animals? And the answer is, well, it wasn't true for the apes. And it didn't seem to be true for Alex. But the problem with Alex, there were 2 problems with Alex. One, we didn't teach him the numbers in order. We first taught him shapes because shapes were fun to chew apart. So he learned 3-corner and 4-corner for a triangle and a square.
Huh.
Okay, 3-corner, 4-corner. Okay. And so when we started doing numbers, well, the easiest thing to teach him was 3 and 4, right? Because he already could say 3-corner and 4-corner. So we taught him about 3 things and 4 things. And then we taught him 2 and 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then we taught him 6 and 1. So he learned them in a, really weird order. So we couldn't make the exact comparisons with the children, but he didn't learn them any more quickly than he learned the other ones. And this was actually the basis of a really important study I did with Susan Carey, who worked with children on these number studies. And, she challenged me as to what was going on here. And I said, well, as I said before, he has to learn how to produce all these sounds. So maybe it's not that he doesn't understand the number concepts, but he's just trying to say these words that are really hard.
When you
So let
taught,
me
okay, sure,
keep
yeah.
going on with this. So what we did was we decided to teach him the labels 7 and 8 totally separate from numbers. Okay. By this time, he also knew Arabic numerals. So we used the 7 and 8 to train him. Now, he didn't know what they meant. I mean, we're just 7 and 8. It could be 10 and 20. I mean, he didn't even know they were numbers probably at that point. Okay. And then we tested him by giving him, once he could say them appropriately, and we first trained him because he also had learned the ordinality of his numbers. So we trained him that 6 was less than 7 was less than 8. So again, but this only meant that he knew that 7 and 8 were bigger than 6. Again, they could have been 10 or 20 or, 200 or whatever. Then the first time we showed him 7 things, and we asked him how many, he looked at it and he looked at it and he went 7. And we added 1 and he went 8. So
he inferred.
he inferred it. He did understand it the way young children do and got it quickly. Whereas the apes did not. They took them just as long to learn 7 and 8 as it took them to learn 5 and 6.
Why do you think it is that a bird would find that easier? Is it because they live in larger flocks, or is it because, I guess when you look at birds in the sky, you can actually pick out their silhouettes, perhaps. And
It could
do
be.
you have any idea?
It could be, but I think it probably has more to do with their vocalizations because, for example, there are certain birds like chickadees with the alarm call, okay? When they see something that's nervous, they go chickadee dee 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 dee, and the number of D's tells you how scary the thing is. So it might be for these birds that there's something about their vocalizations, the number of times they repeat their vocalizations, or the number of times they repeat parts of their vocalizations, might have something that has real meaning for them. And therefore, they need to recognize number in a sense that, apes that just have basically, they have their certain calls and things may not.
And so you had taught Alex, the first parrot that you had, how to say, he would say 3 corner and 4 corner for triangles and squares.
Mm-hmm.
When he learnt the number 5, could you then show him a picture of a pentagon and he would say 5 corner? Would he make up that word?
Yes.
Wow, okay. So it shows that he really did understand these there were genuine concepts in his mind, not just he wasn't he couldn't have been mimicking that because you had never said 5 corner in front of him. Did you make sure not to do that? Or
yeah, what happened was, I'm trying to remember back. Probably what happened was we asked him what shape and he probably said corner. Okay, because he knows that there was corners and he probably didn't know what we wanted us to do. And then we probably asked him how many corner.
Mm-hmm.
And then he probably went, 5 corner. Okay, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really remember because that was so many years ago.
Oh, that'd be really interesting to know.
Yeah, I have to go back and look at some of the data we have, but I really don't remember.
Did you have to keep, I guess you were keeping meticulous records of urine. You must just have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours with these parrots recording everything. Is that the case? Or?
We couldn't record everything because transcribing everything would, it takes you twice as long to transcribe something as it does to, do it. But we do have, we did. Okay, I lost many of these tapes in a flood. Okay. But we did have hours and hours and hours of a lot of this documentation. Not every single thing, of course, but a lot. And you got to remember, we were starting this stuff in the 70s. Taping was not like what we're doing now. When I started, it was reel to reel. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How many people had a decent reel to reel tape recorder in those days? Just being able to afford a Nagra, was half your grant. And then we got on to things where you could get, cassette tape recorders that were reasonably decent. Okay. And so we could start making a lot more of that stuff. Video. Video was like this huge camera that was, twice as big as my head to bring in when we started it. It wasn't, you couldn't just put your little iPhone right up there and take a clip.
I just realized I'm thinking about. So you said to say 7. He said 6 and 1 or 6. Did he?
He just went 1.
Okay, so but he didn't say and or like so and or. These are complicated concepts, right? Did he have a concept of and or I guess on the emotional side, did he understand? I've heard that he said sorry. Did he understand that meant sorry? Or
okay, well, something like sorry. Okay, he understood it was a contextually applicable vocalization. So if he did something and I went ow, and he could hear from me that he bit and it was too hard. Usually they give you a little warning bite before they really crunch. And if he went too hard and I went ow, he'd go sorry, because that would completely, and he said it in this cute little voice, sorry. Okay, that it would, completely break, the interaction. But Did he understand it? Not in the sense that there was any contrition.
Hmm.
Okay. He understood it was the right thing to say in that circumstance. I mean, I joke it was kind of like my ex-husband who would, say sorry and then he would do the same stupid thing, the next time the opportunity appeared. No contrition involved. But um, anyway, the point was, so in terms of his phonemes, I think that's what you were getting to. Okay. We were teaching him phonemes at that point. So he was beginning to learn phonemes and he had began to have some concept of the phonemes. Because there's
Hmm.
this wonderful little story, okay, when I was at the Media Lab. And the Media Lab is an amazing place. We They did all sorts of stuff. And twice a year, they had what was basically demos for all the companies that help support the research. And so everybody would show what they had been working on for the last 6 months. And we had all this stuff arranged because we had been working on all sorts of cool stuff with the parrots. Um, you know, Something we called it Netscape Explorer, a kind of a web browsing system for the birds and all this kind of stuff. And when they came to the lab, the people there said they wanted to see Alex do his phonemes. So I'm going like, okay, you're the guys paying the bills, whatever. So I put, refrigerator letters. That's what we're using, that you use with children. I put them on the tray. They're different colors, and the task was things like, what color is S? And if it were blue, he'd say blue. And I'd say, that's right. And we'd reward him with the nut.
Is that for six? Sorry.
There's just the S sound for the S, okay? Because
Oh,
it
for
was
the
just,
S. Okay.
right, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Or it was, what sound is purple? And it could be an N, so we'd go N, okay?
Mm.
Okay. So we did this, but, these people are with you only for like 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, it's because they're going on to, everybody in the entire lab. So we start this off, and I'm not giving him his nuts as his reward because I don't, if he's sitting there eating a nut, that could take up almost the whole time that they're there. All right. So I ask him one question, he gets it right. He says, want a nut? And I said, wait, I asked him another question, and he gets it right. And he says, want a nut with a little bit more intensity. And then, the third question, and he gets it right. And he goes, want a nut? Huh. And at this point, I'm just about ready to drop the tray because we had never trained him to put phonemes together. He had been trained on the n and the t, but never on the sound. And here he's doing that. And I'm just going, good boy. And I'm smiling. I'm giving him a big nut. And I'm thinking, and meanwhile, I'm going, oh my, we just got this incredible stuff that we have to start working on. But other things interfered, and we didn't get a chance to expand on that. But the point is, he understood where we were going and jumped 2 steps ahead.
Oh, did he ever do anything similar to that again, or was that the only time he did sort of this spelling?
That was the only time he did the spelling. But I mean, he did things like that. That kind of idea of, look, I know where you're headed. This is boring. Let's go on to the next step. A couple of times in the lab, it was quite shocking.
It must be quite difficult because you want to make everything scientific, right? And he does this thing one time,
Right.
and then you're like, I want that to be reproducible, but it must take a lot of effort to get reproducibility out of it.
Exactly. And that was the point. We would have had to start another project in the lab to study that.
Mm-hmm.
And we just didn't have the time. There were too many other things we were doing at that moment.
I see. So, what were you able to achieve in terms of vocabulary? Both did he have a? So this is Alex, your first parrot you had, who was the superstar, right? Was he special, or was it just that you had him for longer, or do you think he was particularly gifted?
Well, he was as I said before, he was an only bird for 15 years. And so he had this small army of people working with him exclusively. And we talked to him all day. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like he was working all day or being trained all day, but we talked to him all day. We'd come in and say, hi, what do you want? Do you want a nut? Do you want, what do you want? Do you want what, do you want banana? Do you want grape? And he would tell us what he wanted. Okay. Or he'd say he wants a grape. And we'd say, what color grape? Because there's purple grapes and there's green grapes. Okay. And sometimes he'd say he want corn, and we say, okay, what color corn? What's color corn? Because we wanted him to work on the color yellow. All right. So we would just, we'd work on things like that with him all day. And if he wanted attention, which he did, he knew he had to talk to us. Um, you know, and it was really intense. But when we got Griffin, okay, so now we're splitting time between birds, and Griffin never had that
Hmm.
that kind of, intensity. He also, okay, we also were doing a study with Griffin because to be blunt, when you're in a university situation and trying to get tenure, now maybe, but not then, just reproducing what you did wasn't going to get you papers and it wasn't
Hmm.
going to get anything. So the idea was to try out different variations of that modeling technique to see actually what aspect of it was valuable and maybe that would help with children who have, learning disabilities. So we started giving Griffin, we tried things like what if we just used an audio tape instead of two people? Or what if we used a videotape of him watching two people? Or, variations on a theme. So he had an immense amount of suboptimal input.
Hmm.
Okay.
I see.
In that period of time when he would have been learning the most and most easily.
Hmm. And your newer parrots, have you gone back to the original way that you were doing things with Alex, or?
We can't just because I just haven't had the opportunity to, basically lock myself and a few students in a room with a bird, 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours a day. So even Athena, we had one student doing a lot of work with her, say for a couple hours every morning, which was great. And she was beginning to acquire her vocalizations. It was one student all the time and two students some of the time. And then the student graduated
Hmm.
and it sort of fell apart and we couldn't get another student to work that shift, and so she has a few vocalizations, but she doesn't seem to care to talk. It's very interesting. She can, when she wants to, she can talk beautifully. The other day we were trying to get her to say orange, which she didn't want to say, but she said the most perfect green I've ever heard from any parrot. And then trying to get her to reproduce it was like, well, I've said it once. I can say it. Who cares? Yeah, it's very
So there's some
interesting.
personality there that sort of can get in the way.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll see what
Did
happens.
did Alex ever ask you questions? So you're there the whole time asking him questions. Did he ever ask you about? I guess
Yeah,
he was limited in what he could say because he could say shapes, what things are made of,
yeah,
colors, and numbers.
yeah.
Right?
But he
That's the
could
four
say he
things.
can ask us, what's that? What color? What shape? He could do
Hmm.
that, and he would. So
Hmm.
that's how he learned carrot. He didn't like vegetables. So I would, sit there. I mean, as a snack, I would, sometimes bring in carrots or something to eat. I never even bothered giving it to him because I knew he would spit it in my face. And one time, it's a Saturday morning, I get a phone call from, a student. She says, "Where are the carrots?" And I'm going, "Huh?" And she says he's asking for carrots. And I'm thinking back that Friday night, my students and I were eating this bag, from this bag of carrots I'd brought in. And he kept saying, "What's that?" And I kept saying, "Carrot." And I'd give him a bite and he'd take a bite and he'd throw it at me. But he kept asking, "What's that?" And we kept saying, "Carrot, it's a carrot." And he already had the word key and parrot in his repertoire. Okay. And the next morning he's going, "Want carrot, want carrot." Now, of course, he wasn't eating them. He just sort of would bite them and throw them. They were a toy for him. But it was like, whoa. And he learned orange by asking us the color of the carrot. He learned gray by seeing himself in a mirror and asking what color. So yes, he learned a lot of vocalizations, and he would also put together vocalizations. So he would babble by himself. So after he learned gray, he'd sit there, playing with it, and all of a sudden comes out grape. Which we talked about grapes when we fed him grapes. We said, "Here's a grape," but we didn't train it. But all of a sudden, he starts saying grape, and then grain, and cane and chain,
Mm-hmm.
that he
So
just
it's like his spelling almost, isn't it? He's like putting putting words together to construct. I'm kind of curious about. So he looked in a mirror and he saw himself and he asked what color, and that's how he learnt gray. Did he learn gray then faster than other colors because he had this association, or?
Well, it's also that he had words like it, so it wasn't
Mhm.
that hard for him to learn it.
So it's not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily indicate that he had like a sense of self or something like this.
Right. I mean,
It could just.
People have claimed that, and I don't, because he had the G sound from green, okay, and he had A from paper. So, hearing gray, it was very easy for him to put together the sounds already in his repertoire to learn it quickly.
But would he pass the mirror test? Is that known for parrots?
It's really complicated because, okay, this is something that everybody's trying to figure out why birds, do they pass the mirror test? There's one or two situations suggesting that, say, example, a magpie might, and then another person replicated the study and said, no, they're just working on the proprioceptive feel of the tag on them and things like that. One of the issues is that these birds see in the ultraviolet, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so does a mirror, well, we know a glass mirror does not reflect in the ultraviolet. So who knows what they're seeing when they see themselves in a mirror, and that might be why they don't really act like they see themselves, because, I mean, it would sort of be like you look in a mirror and you see this green blobby creature, instead of you. Okay, and you have some sense of what you look like in the sense that, you can see your hands, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, and they can see their feet, they can see their chest, and they look in the mirror and there's, what is this thing? So we don't know. And there's some hope at some point that we can do some stuff. I mean, there's some work being done. I don't want to go into it because it's not in my lab, but some suggestion that there was ways of getting around this and studying it.
But because you can have this sort of back and forth, I'm not going to call it conversation, but this back and forth with your birds, does this allow you to actually unlock the way that they see the world? So for instance, can you sort of get an idea of what it is that, how they perceive things, what what it is like to view in the ultraviolet, all these interesting questions, because you can sort of ask them to a certain extent?
Yeah, we started a study like that. We started collaborating with a colleague at Princeton on that just before COVID hit.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully when it's safe to travel again, because she has all this equipment that she could tell us exactly what colors these things that we see, for example, as orange, what they look like to the bird in the ultraviolet.
I see. So do you have situations where you would say, what color is this? And you pick up a thing and you think it's green, but because it's also,
Yes.
sending out. Okay, so you can actually make a mistake with the parrot where you're the one making the error, not the parrot.
Right. And
because to them it looks.
Yeah, we found that Griffin Alex had a really tough time with things like orange, and particularly orange and purple, because and they didn't. What we thought was orange, I mean, who knows what he saw it, and it's purple. I mean, even purple. There are things that you would call purple, and I would say, well, that looks more blue to me, or looks more red to me, or something like that. So we basically got a bottle of non-toxic paint, children's non-toxic paint. This is orange, and this is what when you see this color, you're going to say orange, and we painted things that color, okay, and that's how we got around it, because that's how we had to get those colors. The same thing with purple. So we had these colors in the lab, but we, said, okay, I don't know what you're seeing, but whatever it is, you're going to call this thing orange.
It must be so confusing for him, because it'd be like if we had an alien who wanted us to have a separate word for blue and light blue, say, but we had no word for green. It'd be infuriating for us, wouldn't it?
But we'd eventually do. I mean, think about it. There are different cultures. split up the spectrum a little bit differently too. So there's even with
So,
humans, it's not only what we see, but how we label. So that's a whole other another topic of conversation.
but so what's their vocabulary like, and is their passive vocabulary significantly larger than the active one?
Probably, probably. I think they understood more than they could state. Griffin has far fewer words than Alex, but I think he understands a lot. Alex had about it was like 50, it was somewhere between 50 and 100 different labels for things. Okay, and the question is, the reason why it's that big is because do you consider, you know, um, things like, a green key different from a rose key? Or do you just say, well, he had the
Hmm.
label key and then he had the, 7 color labels and, 7 object shape labels and things like that. Okay, so,
Hmm.
but he had, labels for colors, for shapes, for numbers. He had phrases like I want X and want to go Y, where X and Y are appropriate object or location labels. And he never said, want to go nut. I mean, he understood that want to go chair, want to go back, want to go shoulder, things like that. And, I want a nut, I want a cork, I want, things like that. He understood.
Hmm.
And if he learned a new label, whether he understood if it was a place or a thing, and he put them in the right sentence frame.
Hmm.
Okay.
So he would construct sentences that had never been said to him before, using the new labels that he
Yeah.
had.
Simple frames. I mean, they were simple sentence frames. It wasn't complicated sentences, but it's I want X, want to go Y. I mean, these are
Hmm.
very, it's, again, when you talk about the difference between language, you and I can construct a sentence that, neither of us have ever heard before. But
Hmm.
he had these little frames that he had heard the frames and he knew what slot to put new things into, which is it's intelligence. No, I mean it's pretty advanced, but it's nothing like what you and I are doing.
So when you taught him three corner triangle, did you always have the same triangle? Like if you took a triangle that was of a different shape, for example, it wasn't isosceles, but it was a right angle or something, would he also call that a three corner or?
And initially, no. Initially, it always was the same triangle because we wanted to get the idea of what it meant. Okay, so
Mhm.
they were slightly different sizes, but it was
Mhm.
basically a wooden triangle, okay? And then we go to, say, a paper triangle or a rawhide triangle to make sure that he understood that it didn't have to be wood,
Mhm.
okay? And then we could go to different, different types of triangles and things to make sure he understood it.
Hmm. Did he have trouble? So he spent a lot of time with you and students. Did he have trouble? So say for example, you and I both said the same word, but I've got a much deeper voice than you do. So would he struggle with the way that I pronounce a word, or would he sort of put them all in the same class?
He was able to put them all in the same class to some extent, okay? So when we had it was very interesting when we had film crews come in from all over the world. So if the people from the film crew had really strong accents, then
Mhm.
he really had trouble because, it was just too weird. But pitch, no. Pitch was,
Mhm.
and I think that's because when we trained him, we had, male and female students working with him.
Mhm.
So which he was, adapted to the pitch. But a really strong accent could throw him off because it was like, even with us, a really strong accent will throw us off in trying to understand what somebody's saying.
Are there any tests that you? Because I imagine, okay, you want to find out some particular thing, whether they, can understand this or that. And so, are there any tests that you developed that you're particularly proud of? Is there any one test that really stands out in your mind?
Let's see. That's a good question. Well, there's some stuff we've been doing with Griffin, and they don't have to do with language per se, although we think that his understanding of symbolic representation helps him on this. Okay. But we've been doing this really interesting study on inference by exclusion. And it's quite fascinating. So I didn't develop it all by myself. I worked with colleagues on this. So it's basically adapting her study to Griffin. But it's really one of these fascinating things. So there's the original 2-cup, okay, exclusion, which it's based on work by people like David Premack, and Joseph Call has adapted it too. But the basic idea is you show the animal, you have 2 different colored cups, and you put, say, a blue jelly bean under one cup and a green jelly bean under the other cup, and they see that. And then you put up a barrier and you take away one of the jelly beans from under the cup. You remove the barrier and say, look, I have the green jelly bean. And then you say, if you want a jelly bean, go find it. So they have to remember which cup had which jelly bean and infer by the fact that, well, the green one's taken away. If I want one, I got to remember where the blue one was. Okay. Well, it turns out, there's some simpler other explanations, like avoid the cup that was emptied or go to the cup next to the empty cup, things like that. So what Susan Carey and her students designed was what's called the 4-cup exclusion, which is, say, 2 sets of 2 cups. And we gave this to Griffin. And so the deal is you have A, B, and C, D, and you put up a barrier and you show, look, I've got a big nut and I'm putting it on this side. And you show them, it's under A, B. I have another nut. Look, I'm putting it on this side. It's under C, D. Okay. Then you remove the barrier. So at this point, all they know is that there's 50-50 on the A's and 50-50 on the AB, 50-50 CD. Then you show them, look, A is empty. Where are you going to get the nut? Well,
Okay.
It's like, okay, it's 100% under B, right? Well, kids have to get it really, really well. I mean, like not just a little bit above chance, but really above chance. They got to be almost 5 years old. Griffin aced this completely. All right. So then we decided, and this is where, the stuff that I was doing comes in. I said, well, maybe he's just going to the cup next to the empty cup. So we decided to make him gamble, to make him go to the other side. So he likes nuts, but he loves Skittles. Okay. I think they're the worst, horrible thing in the world, but this bird will kill for a Skittle. So the idea was, okay, you got to putting a nut on this side and a Skittle on this side. And you show him, A is empty. You have a 100% chance of a nut, but you got a 50% chance of getting that Skittle that you really, really want. So we put in just a few of those trials into the, mixed in with the normal trials, and he gambled because he really wanted that Skittle, okay? And if he gambled and won, he'd gamble the next time one of those trials came up. If he lost, he might wait a couple of trials before he'd gamble again. So he really, understood what was going on there. It turns out there's some other, other low-lying concepts, and we're doing some other studies to nail it down even further. But I mean, this was a really fun thing that we came up with to see what he was doing.
How noisy are your tests? So I imagine, because it sounds like they're quite intelligent, so they must get bored sometimes. So
Yes.
when you're asking them to do a test,
You're never going to get 100% from them.
Yeah, so that's my question. So like if they are responding, if I read one of your papers and it said, they were correct when they said, this word or did this task 80% of the time, should I infer that 20% of the time they were confused or 10% of the time they were just bored and 10% of the time they were annoyed, or how should I read the numbers?
Well, it's generally annoyed or bored or something like that because they're so far above chance that it's so statistically significant. It's not like it's 0.05. It's usually 0.001 or 0.0001. Okay, so that suggests that they really are. And again, With Alex, I mean, it was very he was much more obvious about this. So imagine I'm giving him a test where there are 6 possible answers, okay?
Hmm.
For like example, what color? It has 6 different colors. So I say, "What color?" And he gives me the wrong color. Okay, so you say he doesn't know the wrong color. But I try and I say, "Okay," I ask him again and again and again. And, 6 times he gives me 5 wrong colors in a row.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, by statistics, there's no way he can give me 5 wrong answers in a row unless he knows the correct answer and he's avoiding it.
Mm.
And we would run this just to show that that was something that he was doing. It was like, I know this is blue. You know that it's blue. I know that you know that you know that I know that it's blue. Why am I having to say this blue? And I'm going, because I need statistical significance and I need 60 trials on this task. So you do this. And it's like, uh, so yeah.
Are there some days that you go into the lab and he would just completely or Griffin or Athena
Yeah.
would they just say not
No.
today? Yeah, so they know how to say no.
Well, Alex and Griffin both have a little noise. But basically, you set up the tray and you put it up, and they look at you and they turn around and they start to preen. Okay. And they just basically go and you go, hey, look, nuts, don't you want to work? And they look at you and go, tickle, which means they want you to, help them preen or something like that. It's very clear. There are times when they just do not want to work.
Do they end up getting like diabetic or anything from just all the Skittles that
Well,
you have to
okay,
provide them
the
with?
Skittles, that's an interesting question because we so rarely do that because and when we were doing that study, we took Griffin in for his annual checkup and the vet literally said, this bird is borderline parrot diabetes. What are you feeding him? We said, we're doing this one study and we only have 2 more trials and we promise we won't give him any more Skittles after this is done. But I mean, yes, it's, these things are, you have to watch. They're supposed to eat, parrot food and not human junk. But this was such a chance to do such an incredible study, and we really didn't realize how much sugar he was getting. But when you think about it, okay, 1 Skittle for him is like our eating 100 or 150 of them.
It's
You know,
like a soccer ball size Skittle for me.
yeah, I mean, it's like our whole big bag of them, in one sitting. I mean, it's ridiculous. So yeah.
But so Griffin was able to compete at the level of sort of a 5-year-old child in this one task. Is there something like an IQ or some like number that you can put down for general intelligence for about, since Griffin could compete at that level on this particular task, would you also expect him to do as well against 5-year-olds in other tasks, or is it very specific?
Well, it turns out he's as good as a 5-year-old on basically a probability task that Piaget gave young children. He's better than 6 to 8-year-olds on a visual working memory task. Okay. Um, there are a couple of other tasks that we're in the process of looking at. So the answer is, on a lot of the tasks we've given him so far, yeah. Okay. I mean, he does the marshmallow test. Do you know what that is?
This is the one where you see whether they can wait for a greater,
Right. I mean,
what are you testing for there?
for executive function, basically, do they have the, ability to sit there and say, well, if I wait, think it through. There's a really nice nut here, but if I wait, I'm going to get a lot more nuts. It's worth waiting for. Okay. And he does it.
How
So we'll
long
wait
can you get him to wait for?
15 minutes.
Oh, that's almost torture.
It is almost torture for both of us because you're standing there watching the clock, tick away, and you're going, please don't eat this, please don't eat it, please don't eat it. And you can't look at him. You can't look at him. You can only look at him through a camera or through the corner of your eye, you know. And he's sitting there and he's preening and he's falling asleep and he's squawking. It's like, he's trying to distract himself because it's so boring. But he knows, I'm going to get this big batch of nuts if I just can wait just a little bit longer.
How do you tell him that how do you give him that information that you will get to if you wait? Like,
Okay.
how do you teach that?
Yeah. So the thing is, that's one of the beautiful things of working with an animal that has language of sorts, symbolic representation. So he already had some comprehension of the label wait. We never trained him on it. But, when I come in the morning, he wants immediately to climb on me, but I have to take off my outer clothing. I have to put on some hand sanitizer. So it's wait, wait, I'll, be with you another. We give them cooked grains every day for lunch and for dinner. And they come out of the microwave, they're too hot. So that has to wait for a minute or two until they cool down. So, they see this bowl of stuff that they want, and we go, wait, wait, just wait a couple of minutes, okay? So they understand to some extent the concept from that.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was just like little kids. I mean, you take a 4-year-old and they understand they have to wait their turn to play. They have to wait for, ice cream for a certain time. I mean, they understand something about waiting. Okay. The question for both the parent and the kids is, would they choose to wait in one of these
Mm-hmm.
situations? I mean, they understand something about that concept, but will they
Mm-hmm.
voluntarily choose to wait? And that's what you're testing. And so you show them, here's, a nut. You can have this nut now, but if you wait, you can have the 3 nuts. And you leave him with the 1 nut. You hold the 3 nuts, he can see them, but he can't get them. And if he waits, the little timer goes off and then he gets to eat the 3 nuts.
But so you show him the 3 nuts. So you put 1 in front of him and you hold 3 and you say wait, and then he associates that word with the 3 that he will get. But how does he know that not to eat the other one? How does he know that? Oh, I see. So the wait is associated to him eating the thing in front of him.
Yeah.
It's still a bit complicated. How does he infer that
Well,
he will eat?
we modeled it. We did that. We did our modeling, like we showed him with. I had a student who modeled it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, not a lot, but I just showed. We showed them 2 or 3 times with the student. If she waited, she got the 3.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. So you use the same training technique that you would just for learning a word or for
Right. I mean,
for
well,
any
it isn't training per se. It's modeling. It's just demonstrating, which is different
Mm-hmm.
from training. Because training is like when you have a dog. Okay, you know the trick with the dog. You put what do you call it? A biscuit on its nose, and you train it to sit there until you give it the release, and then it can flip over and get the biscuit. Okay. I mean, that's training. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It has no option. It's trained to do something. It's not voluntarily waiting. Okay. It's a hard level training, because if it doesn't wait, everything, the biscuit goes away completely.
Mm-hmm. So
Whereas,
how did you distinguish a wait as a command from wait as a
well, because he
how
could,
did you distinguish that?
well, because I mean, basically, if we did some controls. So we give him 3 and we tell him to wait for 1. So if it was a command, he would wait no matter what, right? Because I'm
Mm-hmm.
commanding him to wait. But he would take 1 look at the 3, look at us, and go, "You're nuts," and he'd just eat the 3.
So you'd give him a worse deal, and he'd be like, "I'm not taking the bad deal."
Right.
Okay, that's quite clever. So it seems like okay. So it seems in certain tasks that he's at least as intelligent as say a 5-year-old or even a young child of some age, and I guess that also means that on some tests he would also be more intelligent than say people who may be mentally disabled, let's say. And so when it comes to the question I want to ask relates to personhood. So is intelligence the only thing that's important there, or is there something additional that humans have that sort of exclude animals like Alex from gaining personhood?
We have no idea. I mean, this is something that people have been, for as long as I've been in the field, people have been trying to figure out. I mean, there's a lot of people who are looking at the, what's called the neural, what is it, NCC, the neurals. It's not the word they don't call center, but it's the neural, let's call it the center, but the neural center of consciousness, neural correlate of consciousness. Okay, NCC. They're trying to find what it is in humans, and do these same things exist in non-humans? And it's really hard in birds because their brains are constructed so differently. I mean, when I talk about having a cortical-like area, it doesn't look like a cortex. I mean, if you look at our cortex, you see all these, what a brain looks like. We call it sulci and gyri, but it's all those, ups and downs and everything that you see. A bird's brain looks like a blob of jello. That's all it
Okay.
looks like, And it turns out that when you do the neurophysiology and the neuroanatomy, it's got the same bits and pieces that our brain has. It just doesn't look like it. And the connections are not always exactly the same. They're similar. So, for example, for vocal learning birds, we have 7 centers that are for vocal learning, and they have 7 centers. And they're actually connected in somewhat similar ways, not identical, but quite similar. Okay. But I mean, it's still blobs of stuff, and compared to what we look like in our brains, it just doesn't look the same. So figuring out what's the same in their brain and what's in our brain is not easy. I mean, when I started giving lectures in the 80s on the work Alex was doing, I mean, there was always somebody in the audience who, raised their hand saying, "But they don't have any cerebral cortex. How can they do what you're saying? There's no cortical area." And I'd say, "You're the neurobiologist. You find it, because these are my data. Okay, this is what the bird is doing. I don't know how he's doing it. You go find the bit of brain that's responsible for it." 2005, Nature Reviews Neuroscience, Jarvis et al., where et al. Is 20 other researchers. They finally published what's called an axis of the, neural area of the bird brain, basically showing which these bits and pieces, correspond to all the bits and pieces in our brain. But it took like 20 something years.
But I suppose my question goes along the lines of, okay, we're having this conversation, but hopefully there's never a point in time when you're holding my brain in your hands to look at the ridges and, see its structure and so on. So you don't really know. You expect that my brain has all the usual features just through our interactions. And so the question is, just through, if you didn't know anything about what a bird's brain looked like and you were just interacting with them and they're displaying all these different sorts of intelligence, these cognitive abilities, is that enough? Is their behavior enough to say, look, this species, maybe whales, maybe chimpanzees, maybe parrots, this species really should be considered this animal really should be considered as a person in a certain sense?
But that's really tough. I mean, think about the Turing test, and think about AI, and think about robots, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's really hard to figure out what is this essence that we call consciousness. I mean, there are people who think it's an epiphenomenon. So it's not a simple, David Chalmers called it the hard question for a good, good reason. We really don't know. We really don't know. I mean, it's certainly when you work with these animals on a daily basis, you treat them as conscious beings because it's almost impossible not to. But again, people treat their dogs as conscious beings. People treat their goldfish, some of them as conscious beings. Can I prove it? At this stage, no, I can't. And neither can anybody else completely prove it. People are writing really interesting papers suggesting these things, but we can't yet prove it.
I think the artificial intelligence idea is interesting because you could have a case where you could develop an artificial intelligence that's much more intelligent than a human, or appears to be. Eventually, maybe you will have a general artificial intelligence that's more intelligent than humans, but maybe you could make the argument that they don't suffer. And so, there are other qualities that humans have and that animals have.
Right. And that's, and that's again, I mean, look, Descartes did not think that animals could suffer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but we know they can.
Now, so then there's the classic question, is there a point at which an animal is so intelligent that when you kill them, it's considered murder? That's the classic question, right?
Right. And, look, I mean, talk to any vegan and they'll say yes.
So we spoke about how self-aware Alex was. Did they... And he would say sorry, but you suggested that he didn't have any contrition. Does it make sense to talk about morals and ethics for animals? Do they have...
I mean, look, if you look at the way they behave in the wild, there is some kind of social structure there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, read a lot of the stuff that Franz de Waal works on the chimpanzees. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there that it's very hard to differentiate from what would go on in a human society. All right. These are really difficult questions, and I'm not trying to be fussy about dancing around them. It's just really hard to try to figure out what exactly is going on, what are their just because their morals might not match up with our morals doesn't mean that they're amoral, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we have different societies, and different societies have different moralities as to what they consider okay, right? I mean, but we don't consider, some people consider if it's not their own morality, it's amoral, but, most people would just consider that, yes, there are different types of, societal mores, let's put it that way.
It's interesting. You made me think of so early on when you had Alex and Griffin together, and Alex was the dominant bird, I imagine that you'd have situations where Alex may bully Griffin, or Griffin would sort of defer to Alex, and so the question you could ask, I guess this is a question you could never answer really, but is it a moral position that Alex eats first, or is you might be able to construct their hierarchy using morality, right? I'm not really sure what words to use here,
right?
But,
I mean, we don't know what words to use here. We know that dominance hierarchies exist. Okay, we know they exist in the wild. I mean, the stronger animal gets more resources, and they're more likely to breed, and so they're likely to have stronger offspring. Okay, so there's this...
Might is right.
Yeah, well, it's genetics. I mean, it's just you want the best genetics in the next generation, things like that. But how does that get into other systems? I mean, it's really a tough call.
I guess also you probably don't want to answer these questions because I don't mean in the context of this interview, but just more generally, at the end of the day, you also need funding, and once you start asking these questions, you start dipping into philosophy and things that are sort of... I'm guessing you already have some difficulty convincing people that... So let me
rephrase that.
Let me say the following. Let me rephrase it. So, your research, it's really captivating for public audiences. People love to hear about the story of Alex, and some of my friends knew who Alex was before I was going to have this discussion with you. But on the other hand, I know that at various times you've had some trouble getting funding.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if the situation would be made more difficult if you start thinking seriously about things like morals and ethics in animals. These are things that you can't really do measurements with, right? It sounds like it's very important for you to be as scientific as possible and do tests where you can really pull out numbers.
Yeah, I mean, if you're applying for a grant from the National Science Foundation, they want data. That's
Hmm.
basically what it's on. And I mean, it's hard enough, trying to explain to them that the data that you're getting that is, I mean, you're getting this from a brain the size of a shelled walnut. It's the question that you asked me at the beginning. And you're trying to convince these people. I mean, I remember being at a conference, 1986, it was the International Primatological Congress, and I was the only person there who wasn't studying primates. And I was in the one session on comparative cognition, and I would, comparative, it's like apes versus Alex, okay? And I get up and I give my talk, and it was on the concept of same and different. And the important thing is that same and different is not identity versus non-identity. Okay, identity versus non-identity is very simple. Is this exactly the same as that, identity versus non-identity?
Hmm.
But same and different is much more complicated because you can have things that are the same but also different. They're the same color but different
Hmm.
shape. Okay.
Hmm.
So what I did based on some work that David Premack had done was to teach Alex same concepts, same and different, so he could look at something and say whether they were same or different with respect to color, shape, matter, or say none if nothing were same or different. So I present this work and this, I'll call him the silverback male, okay? The senior primatologist in the group stands up and I'm going like, oh, okay, here it comes. And he says, you mean to tell me that your bird, and he says it rather pejoratively, is doing the same thing that Premack's apes are doing? And I wanted to say, yeah, backwards and in heels, because we actually had done a slightly more complicated test than Premack. But I didn't say that. I figured that would, and I said, yes, sir. And he goes, oh, and he sits down. And it was like the audience is going, oh, it's like, she's doing this stuff. I mean, it was so hard for them to believe that this work was, was real. And again, it was one bird. I didn't have a whole flock of them. And
Hmm.
you have to argue that, this one bird could do it and therefore the species could do it. But I'm sure that there are differences amongst birds and again, personalities. As I said, Athena is extremely smart, but her attitude is, girls just want to have fun. I mean, she just, she'll work when she wants to, and when she works, she's just so on target. But half the time, it's just like, no, I want to chew paper. I want to preen. I don't want anything to do with you.
So is there a lack of funding in general for animal cognition, I guess you'd call it?
Yes, I mean, it's a very, very difficult field to get funding for. There are some places where there's lots of funding and lots of appreciation. So, Austria, okay, they have the University of Vienna has a department of cognitive ethology, okay. They put in millions of euros to graduate student funding for animal cognition. University of St. Andrews has a really beautiful program, okay, in animal cognition. Most other schools, if you're lucky, there's maybe one person in the whole university doing it, and getting funding for it is really hard. I mean, that's one of the reasons a lot of my colleagues are now looking at dog cognition because they don't have to, run a lab. They basically can use, have people bring their dogs in and test the dogs, and they don't have to, have animals living on the premise and taking care of them 24/7, because that's one of the big expenses. We're not curing cancer, okay? We're not at this point. We're not curing AIDS. To try to explain to people that, okay, but we're studying basic levels of intelligence. We're studying motivation. We're studying things that, could maybe help you when you're trying to teach children. But it's like, no, 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 no. If we want to work with children, we're just going to work with children. And there's a point to it, but, if we're going to understand the evolutionary bases of our behavior, we have to study animals because
Hmm.
we don't know where the origins of our behavior unless we
Hmm.
study them in animals. And that's why this is so important. And again, if you want to share a world with non-humans,
Hmm.
the only way to understand what they need is to understand their cognitive processes.
Hmm.
Okay? Uh, you know, we we have a world that is between, climate change and all sorts of, other, extractive industries and things. We're tearing our world apart. We're losing species. I mean, gray parrots are now CITES 1 endangered species. 1995, we could have told them that we were trying to tell them that this was going to happen given the level of poaching and the level of habitat destruction, but nobody wanted to listen because there were still, flocks of 1,000 grays in Africa. But hey, 30 years and they're CITES 1 endangered. Well, it took, 20 years for them to be CITES 1 endangered. So we need to learn about these creatures with whom we're sharing the world. But it's really a hard sell.
In terms of, I mean, this might also be one of the reasons why there's this, you know, this might be why it's difficult for people working on apes to believe that Alex could do the things he could do, right? Because there's competition. Um, you take funding, I suppose, that they may
Sure.
get.
Oh, yeah. I
Is
mean,
that an
it's,
element, or?
yeah. I mean, one colleague was very blunt about it. He didn't say it to my face. He said it to another one of his colleagues. And of course, the second colleague was a friend of mine and I heard it. Um, that's true. It's also, I mean, think about the whole point where, a lot of humans feel they have dominion over everything else. Okay. And, it's what you got back into what you were sort of talking about. How much right do we have to do animal experimentation on animals? Now, there's a difference between talking to an animal and sticking electrodes in its brain and slicing and dicing, but experiments, do we have the right to do this? Do we have the right to eat them? Do we have the right to test drugs on them? There are
Mhm.
all these questions that come up that
Do you have problems with? Sorry for interrupting. Do you have problems with animal rights activists then, with your own work, or?
I personally don't, because people who are animal rights who have visited the lab have written papers saying, this is, if you're going to study animals, hey, these birds are basically treated like kindergartners, you know. So they realize that, we're not doing anything bad or stressful or anything to them. But I have been at a conference where somebody inappropriately accused me of doing invasive research
Mhm.
and, made it very clear that what he thought about me and my research inappropriately, but, you know,
What did he mean by invasive?
well, they said that, we were slicing and dicing parrot brains
Oh.
and, we were not.
Do you
But
have enough parrots to do that?
hey, these birds, right now a gray parrot is going for over $6,000. A baby gray is costing over
Mhm.
$6,000. There's no way that people are going to do that kind of research on a creature that costs $6,000.
Mm.
To be blunt, but I mean, the people who are doing some neurobiology on them are basically trying to find birds that are at the that need to be euthanized for health reasons.
I see.
And they're basically sitting there. So as soon as the bird goes, they immediately get permission and take it and do some studies on the brain and things
Mhm.
like that.
You're also involved with METI, right? I was reading the messaging extraterrestrials.
Oh,
I was
yes, yes. Well, the idea is that, I mean, to be blunt, if somebody's going to talk to ET, those of us who are already talking to aliens on the planet should be the ones involved.
What role do you play there? You're an advisor, are you, on how
Yeah,
to go about?
it's just, I mean, I don't know that anything's ever going to happen, but yes, it's the idea of the fact that there are not just I, but a bunch of us who work on animal communication, have some skills of looking at different ways of communication. I mean, to be blunt, communication amongst animals, it's not just vocalizations. I mean, it's pheromones, it's, you know, body signals. It's a very complicated system, and we need people who are aware of all the different ways that communication can happen if we're going to, possibly uncover some kind of, ET type creature.
So have you made recommendations for the sort of messages that should be sent, if messages will be sent, or how does your how do you advise? What role do you play?
So far, all this is a book that is yet to be published, where we present our ideas. Okay, we're still waiting for the book to get published. It's been a couple of years now. It's been sitting on the editor's desk. So,
Are you able to share any of the tantalizing ideas, or this is before publication, hush hush?
no, it's just, I mean, we basically say, look, this is what we found in non-humans. Okay.
Hmm.
So if you find some other creature, we have these skills that we can use. And you know, that's basically what it is at this point. No, nobody has come to us the way the Carl Sagan, golden disc type thing, or at least they haven't come to me. Maybe they've come to some other people in the group.
So I want to wrap this conversation up, and before I do that, I have one sort of out of left field question, and then a few questions looking towards the future.
Okay.
So I apologize if this is a little bit left field, but I'm kind of curious how someone with your expertise and experience would answer the question. So, do you know about the blue fox experiments, where they, or is it these fox experiments in Russia where they tamed foxes over many generations? It's blue foxes, right? So the question is, let's say, for example, you wanted to do a similar experiment where over many generations you breed for a certain characteristic. And in this case, it's intelligence. So say, for example, you wanted to build up a species that is as intelligent as possible, and I give you, a couple hundred generations. The question is, how would you go about doing that? What animal would you choose, and what characteristics would you breed for?
Well, I mean, first of all, with the foxes, you can do things like artificial insemination. You can, it's, I mean, when you get intelligent creatures, you can't just make them breed. So right away, you have an issue right there. Okay. They might not like each other. They might not want to breed with one another. So I'm going to nix it right from the beginning. I mean, it's not simple. I mean, even when you look at flocks of birds in the wild, all right?
Hmm.
They, the intelligent ones like the parrots, they mate for life. And they find their mates through whatever process they go for. And when one of their mates dies, they don't just randomly hook up with the next, free bird available, okay? They often mourn, and I won't say mourning in the sense that we engage in mourning, but they don't do normal behaviors for a while, and they don't immediately, remate and stuff. So I find it, the more intelligent the creature, the harder it would be to design something like that.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying morals and ethics would get in the way primarily?
I think so. Yeah.
But let's say they were taken off the table, and you're...
I mean, you can't. That's the whole point. You can't. You can't take these things off the table. And what levels of intelligence? I mean, in individual parrot species, okay, are particularly good at different things. So if you
Mm-hmm.
look at, cockatoos are great at tool use. All right.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different type of intelligence than what we get with grays. Grays are pretty crummy at tool use. They don't,
Mm-hmm.
they're just not, I mean, when you even give them the option to play with things, they play with them, but not to nearly the extent that, for example, cockatoos or even macaws do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, what do you choose for? You know, it's not something that's a simple game.
Hmm. Then let me ask, let's say you could ask your birds any question and you'll get a sensible response that makes sense. So now it's not just what color, but you can ask
Right.
any question. What do
Ooh,
you wish you could ask them?
interesting. That is very interesting. Actually, I think I would ask what would make them happy.
It's very consistent with your last answer. I like it. But wouldn't you be upset if they just said grape or something in response?
Probably, but then I would say, well, it has something to do with the amount of, you know, vocabulary that they have with which they could answer. So,
Hmm. So then, looking towards the future, in the field of, if you had your dream scenario unfold for the field of animal cognition, what would it look like? What do you hope the
oh,
future looks like for your
what
field?
I would love is that if there were several institutes of animal behavior, around at universities, that every big university had an institute of animal behavior and would have the funding and the resources to have people, a lot of people at each of these universities looking at, and I'd say animal behavior, not necessarily even animal cognition, but of animal behavior, of which cognition would be one aspect, so that that students coming in would understand that this is a viable field, it's an important field, and that it's a supportive field, and it's something that we need to study.
Escaped Sapiens.